I had been covering for her for 8 months before I understood what I was covering for. Not intentionally. Not even consciously, for most of it. I was covering for her the way you cover for a colleague you trust, absorbing the questions she wasn't there to answer, explaining the delays she hadn't explained, picking up the edges of work that fell near enough to mine to pick up without it being conspicuous. I thought I was being a good colleague. I thought she was going through something. I thought we were the kind of coworkers who helped each other without keeping score. I was half right about the last part. We weren't keeping score. But the person not keeping score was me. Her name was Vivian. We had worked in the same team for 3 years. The dynamic between us was comfortable and easy, we had the same professional humor, a similar approach to the work, the shorthand that develops between people who spend a lot of time in the same organizational context. I liked her. I trusted her in the specific way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to. The problem with that kind of trust is that it doesn't update well. You set the default to positive and you keep it there unless something dramatic arrives to change it. The subtle things, the small inconsistencies, the patterns visible only in aggregate, don't trigger the update because each individual instance is explainable. And Vivian was good at the explainable. When she wasn't at a meeting she should have been at, there was always a reason, a client call, an urgent delivery, something she was dealing with that sounded plausible. When she hadn't done something she was supposed to have done, she had a version of events that placed the delay in context. She was not apologetic in a way that felt excessive. She was apologetic in a measured way that felt genuine and then moved on. She moved on very efficiently. That was the tell I recognized only later. The month everything became visible was the month I got sick. A proper illness, nothing serious, but significant enough that I was out for 2 weeks and then working at reduced capacity for another 2. I couldn't cover for anyone. I couldn't absorb the edges of anything. I was fully occupied with my own work and my own recovery. In my absence, several things fell through. A deliverable that had been proceeding, I had assumed, turned out not to have moved at all in the previous 2 months. A client communication that Vivian had told me was not handled. A piece of work I had thought was 50% done was not started. My manager called me while I was still recovering. She was not angry, she was confused. She was trying to understand how several things had simultaneously failed to progress without anyone flagging it. I was confused too. Then I started to reconstruct. I went back through my notes. I looked at the months of conversations and updates and the things I had absorbed on the edges and the things she had told me and the things I had reported to my manager based on what she had told me. The picture that emerged was not of someone who was struggling or overwhelmed or going through something difficult. It was of someone who had very efficiently redistributed her work, to me, to the ambient expectation that things were progressing, to the general organizational noise that makes certain kinds of inactivity invisible. She had not been doing a significant portion of her work for 8 months. And I had, without realizing it, been providing the cover that made this possible. I thought carefully about what to do with this. My manager needed to understand what had happened. That was clear. The question was how to be honest about my role in it, how much I had absorbed, how long I had been doing it, what I had and hadn't known. I decided to be completely transparent. Not to protect myself specifically, but because I believed the honest account was the only one that would actually resolve anything. I sat with my manager for 2 hours. I brought my notes. I walked her through 8 months of what I had observed and what I had done and what I had not understood I was doing. She was, I think, surprised by the level of documentation. I had kept notes not because I was suspicious of Vivian but because I keep notes generally. It's a professional habit. Those notes, in this context, turned out to be exactly what was needed. Vivian was managed out of the organization 3 months later. I don't know the full details of the process, those are not mine to know. What I know is that the account I gave my manager, supported by the notes, was part of what made this situation visible and addressable. The lesson I took was not about Vivian specifically. It was about the structure of covering for someone, how easy it is to do it without knowing you're doing it, how the trust relationship enables it, and how the person you're covering for may or may not know the cost of what they're receiving. I don't think Vivian thought of it as my cost. I think she had found a way of operating that worked for her and hadn't examined its effects on others too carefully. That's a specific kind of person. And recognizing them requires paying attention to a specific kind of pattern. Keep notes. Pay attention to aggregate patterns, not just individual incidents. And be thoughtful about what you're absorbing when you help someone, and what they're doing with the space your help creates. Subscribe. New story every week. I want to say something about the emotional complexity of what I went through, because I think it's often oversimplified in stories like this. When I reconstructed what had happened over those 8 months, my first feeling was not anger. It was embarrassment. I had been used, and I hadn't noticed, and I was the person in the story who had been walking around thinking I was being a good colleague while actually being an unwitting enabler of someone else's extended non-performance. That embarrassment took some time to work through. It felt like my trust had made me naive. Like I should have seen it. Like a more perceptive person would have noticed earlier. I've thought about this a lot since, and I don't think that's right. A more suspicious person might have noticed earlier. But a more suspicious person would also have had a worse working relationship with Vivian during the period before things became clear, would have been less effective as a colleague generally, and would have spent 3 years of professional energy on a level of vigilance that was disproportionate to the actual risk. The trust was appropriate. The situation was unusual. The trust made me useful to someone who was acting in bad faith, but the trust itself was not the problem. The problem was her behavior. Not my trust. I think it's important to be precise about this, because stories about being betrayed can leave you with the message that trust itself was the mistake. I don't believe that. I believe trust is the foundation of functional professional relationships, and withdrawing it categorically in response to a single bad experience is a disproportionate and costly response. What I did change was my documentation practices, my awareness of aggregate patterns, and my attention to the specific dynamic of consistently absorbing someone else's work. Those are targeted adjustments to a specific vulnerability, not a wholesale withdrawal of trust. The distinction matters. Trust less and you lose more than you protect. Trust with attention and you keep the benefits while reducing the exposure. Subscribe. New story every week. I want to say something about the specific grief of finding out someone you loved had been managing information about their own life, protecting you, they would say, but also making decisions that belonged to you without your participation. It is a particular kind of loss. Not only the loss of the person, which is complete and enormous and doesn't require elaboration, but the loss of the 8 months. The loss of the version of that time where I would have known. Where I could have been present differently. Where the conversations we had about the future might have been different conversations, more honest, more urgent, more alive to what was actually happening. He gave me 14 months of honest time. He kept 8 months for himself. I can see why he kept them. I understand the decision he made. I also feel, at a level below understanding, the specific sorrow of having missed those 8 months. Of having had conversations about things that did not ultimately matter, while the thing that mattered was being carried alone in a room I wasn't in. That grief doesn't resolve. I've stopped expecting it to. What I do with it instead is try to be more honest, more available, more present in the relationships I have now. Not as a memorial to him, that seems like the wrong framing. But as a use for what he taught me. He taught me what it costs to manage another person's access to the truth. He paid that cost alone, and when he told me, he was paying it again in a different direction. I am trying to pay it as little as possible. To say the hard things earlier. To let people in when the instinct is to handle things privately. To trust that the people who love me can hold the weight of what's actually happening. It doesn't always work. But I try. He deserved someone who could have tried sooner. I am trying, now, for him. Subscribe. New story every week. One more thing. After the situation resolved and Vivian was gone and things had settled, several colleagues approached me individually to say that they had noticed things too, small things, individual things, each of which they had filed away without acting on. None of them had put it together into the larger picture. Neither had I, for 8 months. This is how systematic underperformance tends to survive in organizations. Each individual instance is small enough to file away. The aggregate is visible only if someone is tracking across time and across people. No single observer has enough data points to see the shape clearly. This is why documentation matters. Not because you should spend your working life building cases against colleagues, but because when something is wrong, the documentation allows you to see the pattern that would otherwise exist only in fragmented pieces. My notes from 8 months made the pattern visible. Without them, I would have had recollections and impressions. With them, I had a timeline. A timeline is significantly more useful than a recollection when you need to describe a pattern clearly. Write things down. Date them. This is the simplest and most underused professional practice I know. Subscribe. New story every week.